Welcome to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. Each brief episode will focus on a specific legal topic to help you better understand the situation you're in and what your next steps might be. Let's join George for this episode. And friends, welcome back. We have attorney George Lamb here in the office, and today we're going to talk about something that's an unfortunate part of family law from time to time, and we're going to talk about emergency protective orders, domestic violent orders, and interpersonal protective orders. George, how are you, guy?
I'm good. How are you?
Man, I'm doing fine. This is a sad part of a lot of these proceedings that you've encountered, and just from a clarity standpoint, you represent clients who at times need to take out one of these orders, but you also represent clients who may need to defend themselves against an order that's been taken out. Is that correct?
Absolutely true.
Good. So let's go ahead and break down the episode really into a number of different segments. First of all, let's jump into just some simple definitions. So people commonly use the term or the abbreviation DVO. What does that mean?
DVO is a domestic violence order, but that's not the first order that you get. The first thing that you would take out would be an emergency order of protection or an EPO. That's actually the first step. And so you have an EPO, which may or may not become a DVO. And then you also have an IPO, which is an interpersonal protective order, which is it's similar, but it's not the same. It has to do with the degree of relationship between the petitioner and respondent. So when you talk about an EPO, what you have is you have an immediate or present danger where somebody swears out a petition. It can be a little, and so that's a civil protective order. So what somebody would do is if they're in fear, and it's a violent situation, they would go down to the domestic violence intake center and they would basically swear out a warrant, and they would tell their story to the intake center, and then that petition goes before a judge. And it goes ex parte, which means the other side doesn't get a say. And then a judge decides whether or not an emergency protective order is entered. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I think the judges err on the side of caution. And so what happens is that if an EPO is entered, then it'll be set for a hearing, which is a domestic violence hearing, which could result in a domestic violence order. And it's not exactly right away. It might take a couple weeks to get to court. And so there is some time between when the EPO, if and when it's entered, to when the domestic violence hearing will actually get on a docket and be heard in front of a judge.
That makes sense. And you said that was under the civil side of it, but also there's a criminal side of this as well, right?
There can be. So you can have a circumstance where, and these are unfortunate situations, but they do need to be addressed because they come up. In every family court division, they have a domestic violence docket, and they are full. And so what can happen is that if an emergency protective order is a civil protective order, it's a civil proceeding, it would be in front of a family court judge. You can have an instance where you could have an assault, which would be a criminal charge. That could be you went to the county attorney downtown and you swore out a criminal charge against somebody. It could be that you don't fit within the category or class of folks that a domestic violence order protects. For instance, if you and a friend are out and you and a friend, not a family member, and there's an altercation, that's not going to be a DVO because you don't fit within the class of people that can be protected by that. So that would be a criminal charge. Or police officers can show up and arrest somebody. That's going to be an arrest charge. Down the road, if you have an EPO, if there's an emergency order of protection, and that means you're going to have to stay away from somebody more likely than not, and and that's a judge's order. And if somebody violates that order, that can be a crime in and of itself. So if you have an EPO, if you get an EPO entered against somebody, or if you have an EPO entered against you, then you have to stay away from that person. And if you don't, then that can be a crime even before you get to the DVO hearing. If there's a DVO entered against someone and they violate that DVO, that can be enforced civilly within the family court process in the form of contempt, or that's also a crime. And so that can be enforced criminally. And so you have to really be careful, when you're dealing with these things.
And that can actually rise to the level of a felony, right?
It can. If you violate, at some point, if you have so many violations, it can be a felony. Or it's not the first one, but yes.
Okay. And let's talk a little bit about the difference between the DVO and the IPO from a definition standpoint.
Okay. A DVO protects a certain class of people. And so you have to have some sort of familial relationship. And so some of these are pretty obvious. A spouse, a former spouse. You're unmarried, but you have a child in common. You're unmarried, but you live together, or you used to live together. Somebody's parent, somebody's child, normal family members, step parent, grandparent. It could be a child. Sometimes adults have to take out EPOs on behalf of children. There's a new rule that says that if there's a child involved, then a guardian ad litem will be appointed for that child. So that's another lawyer that will be in the courtroom during the process. So those are the people that generally get protected by a DVO. So think family member. An IPO is a little different. It's relatively new. And so what happens there is it's more about dating violence. So you would be a victim of dating violence. Maybe you didn't live together. A victim of stalking, a victim of sexual assault. So it's a little different. And it's not in the family court context. That's a district court proceeding, which is a little different.
Okay. So now let's kind of transition into the context behind this. And I thought as we were preparing for this, you made a really interesting statement. You said a domestic violence order is really more about power and control. Can you unpack that?
Sure. So domestic violence is really about somebody trying to exercise power and control over someone. And so there's certain factors that contribute to that. And then certain things you would think about. You would think about physical violence. Those are pretty overarching things. You would think about sexual violence. But what happens is that there's in a lot of people associate domestic violence with anger, and anger is really a byproduct of not getting what you want. And so if somebody is pushing back on someone else trying to exercise power and control, that's where the violence stems from. At the end of the day, violence is bad. It doesn't really matter, but it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You're not supposed to be violent towards people. You're supposed to keep your hands to yourself. I mean, you're talking about old preschool type rules. You just don't get what you want because that's what you want. But if you want to really try to peel back the root of this, there's more subtle characteristics of domestic violence, such as people are coercive or they threaten, but they don't always threaten necessarily the victim. They may threaten self-harm to get what they want. That happens. That's domestic violence. If somebody is threatening suicide, I'm going to kill myself if you don't, or I'm going to harm somebody else, that's violence. That's not overt violence, but that's a threat of violence. Intimidation, that kind of goes without saying. That can be very overt, or that can be very subtle. Emotional abuse, this is a big one. As far as, just putting you down or making you feel bad about yourself, constantly calling you names, doing it in front of other people. There's certain characteristics of these things that are just kind of commonsensical. Abusers gaslight. Oh, it wasn't so bad. Oh, I didn't mean it. Very apologetic after something happens. And it's pretty hard. I think it's very hard to get out of these types of relationships. It takes a victim of domestic violence, they say, at least 7 times to try to leave, because it's difficult. Because the same problems that they have within the abusive relationship, you got the same problems on the outside of it. The money problems within it, money problems outside of it. You need money to leave. They're controlling the money. That's a big one. And so when you have economic abuse, that's the subtle one. You're not in control of any of your finances. One person controls it all. They don't want somebody to get a job. They make you ask them for money. These are things that kind of contribute to it. Isolation's a big one. And this is, they try to prevent the other person from having friends, from having contact with their family members, all those types of things. Things that you would, using their kids as weapons, all that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of what goes to it. As far as the process, once you have an EPO entered, then it'll be set for a hearing. An EPO is about immediate and present danger. If you get an EPO entered against you, or you have an EPO entered, for your protection, the other person, if you live together, they're going to have to leave the house, or they're going to have to stay 500 feet away from you. And if you live together, they're going to be out until the hearing. When you get to the hearing, that's a little different. Then the person has a right to be heard, and the judge is going to try to determine whether or not, and the legal standard is preponderance of the evidence. That means more likely than not. That means 51%. That means they believe one person over the other. It's based on credibility and other evidence.
And that's a lower standard than reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable
Absolutely.
doubt. Right?
It's a lower standard. It's an easier burden to make. And so the court is going to decide whether it's more likely than not that domestic violence and abuse has occurred and may occur again. And so that's going to be, and these hearings it's a limited amount of time. And there's a whole lot that goes into them. There's a whole lot of emotion. And so there'll be testimony. There'll be, if you have documentary evidence, if you have photographs, there'll be photographs. There could be medical records. There could be videos. There could be text. Just think about, this person, generally speaking, that is on the other side of this. And so whatever interactions you've had with them, whether you said it or whether you typed it or whether you took a picture or a snap, or, if there's evidence of abuse and you went to the doctor and there's photographs of it, that's going to come in. But you have a limited amount of time in front of the court to get that done, just because the dockets they're busy. It's not that the courts aren't trying. It's that there's a lot of people that need service. Then what happens is that the judge will decide at the end of the DVO hearing if they make a finding of domestic violence. Then that temporary order, that emergency protective order, can become permanent to a degree. It can last up to 3 years. You may have to stay away from somebody for up to 3 years. You may not be going back to where you live. You may, if you own weapons, you're not going to be able to have weapons anymore. It can be renewed. There's also child custody issues that can be awarded in there, as far as temporary custody issues, temporary child support. If children need services, judge may enter some kind of parenting schedule, likely some supervised visits. As far as that, kind of depends on whether or not the abuse was directed at a child, but you're not going to be interacting with that co-parent as you were. At least you're going to be restricted. And so DVOs are restrictive, and that's why they're important. Now, the other part of this is that not everybody tells the truth. And so a lot of people on the receiving, some people, I don't know about a lot, but there are instances out there where it's not true. And you need to be defended, because all these things that I just said could be against you, and maybe you didn't do it. And it could be that somebody wants leverage. It could be, you're an example, you're in the middle of a divorce case. There's a house. Both people want it. People do this. They use this process to get somebody out of the house. They use this process to get an advantage when it comes to children. If there's a process out there, some people will misuse it. And this is no different. Not to say that there isn't violence out there, not to say that this isn't appropriate, but if you're on the receiving end of an EPO or a DVO and you didn't do it, you're going to need to be defended, and you would likely need to contact an attorney to do so, because it's pretty hard to do by yourself.
Wow. George, obviously, this is a very emotional, aspect, and it often comes up in family law, obviously. In the show notes for this episode, I'm going to insert some directions as to where the individual would go down to the intake center, and that intake center is open 24/7, I believe.
It is.
It's right downtown. And then I'll provide some other information that if somebody needs to take out one of these orders or petitions, how they can do that. So hopefully that'll be helpful to your listeners.
Sure, absolutely. The Domestic Violence Intake Center, they have one in every jurisdiction. They have one I know there's one downtown in Jefferson County. I know that they have them in Oldham. I know that they have it in Bullitt County. This is not something that is unfamiliar territory. I mean, these resources are available for people that do need them.
Outstanding. Well, George, once again, thanks very much for your time today. I hope this was informative. And there's a little bit of confusion from time to time as far as what these are and how they're used. And I especially appreciate the fact that you brought up that, sometimes you need to be defended against these. And again, in your practice, you handle both sides of that. So it makes it a little bit more helpful. But so again, just one more aspect of family law. And it's unfortunate, but it does happen. But good news is, with George Lamb, you've got an attorney who's been down this road, who understands it and knows what to do as soon as it surfaces.
Yeah, that's true. If you need to reach me for something like this, you can check my website at lambandlamb.com. You can call me. You can call or text me at 502-640-9797. You can email me at george@lambandlamb.com. I'd be happy to speak to you.
Thanks for your time, George.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Is It Time for a Lawyer podcast with attorney George Lamb. We hope you found the discussion informative and helpful. The comments George made are not meant to be legal advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship. However, if it is time for a lawyer, George is ready to listen. Be sure to share this episode on your social media. George will be back in 2 weeks with his next episode. Thanks again for listening.